is we seem to have a little bit of a downstream problem where we're sometimes freezing up, and then when it does, I think it goes away. We'll just try this, okay? All right, so we're here to identify leadership skills, and we're going to use real life examples of those. And the example we're going to use today are all the things that came together to create, what today is now a feature of Siouxland, which is Dakota Dunes. And I have to tell you, it was a lot of fun coming back through this and looking at all this and remembering that time before it existed. That's been kind of fun. But we're going to examine how these folks use these skills, going to try to bring some examples forward, and then we're going to see if at the end we can weigh in and show positive results of good leadership. Now, remember, we've been doing this for a long time. So, I boiled it down to these skills. The biggest one, that insight, is so important because it's the ability to correctly define the issues. What happens if you think you know what the problem is, but you've defined it wrong? You could then have great vision, great communication skills, great resolve, and still fail, right? Because you aren't fixing the right thing. So the ability to correctly define what the issues are becomes very important. And I have to tell you, I want you thinking about that one today. Why was Dakota Dunes created? What issue was that designed to fix? And we have to weigh that and see, okay, was this a way to fix that? Did it fix it in the end? That's one of the questions we're going to be asking. Now, the thing we usually talk a lot about is that vision of the ability of one of these leaders to see a path that overcomes those issues, and then to communicate that path, that vision, to everybody else and get them to go along with that person. And as we all know, and remember our talk on Rockefeller, he said that resolve, the perseverance to continue to work toward that end is the most important skill of all those. Your vision could be a little weak, your insight or your communication skills might be weak, but you could make up for that by continuing to work. Now, I'm not sure if that's absolutely true, but it is vitally important, isn't it? I don't know if I would say it is the most important, but then again, you could have all these other things, and if you can't carry through, not going to do anything, right? And then a big one that sometimes is lacking is the concept of inclusiveness, the ability to work with others toward a greater good, not just a short-term win. We often think all the time of short-term wins. What do I got to do? I just have to meet this issue. Boom, we got it done. It's a win for me, lose for you. I don't care. I get the money. Good. No, the ability to work with others for that greater good, because think about it. Otherwise, it's kind of like you are shortchanging somebody, and if you think about that, that can go for quite a while. But then sooner or later, the person you're shortchanging finally says, this isn't a win for me no matter what I do. So I don't care. I'm not helping you any longer. I'm not working with you any longer. Now, remember, I said we've been doing these a long time, and I spent an awful lot of time doing this with people in the public eye, i.e., politicians. And this is what I developed that for. But since we've been working a lot more with leaders in the business world, looking when we went through with Warren Buffett and with Rockefeller and these others, I tried to look at the terminology they were using. And here's what I've come up with over these courses. They're all the same skills, but here's how they think of them. The innovation, the creativity, i.e., being able to see what the issues are. Can they creatively get past just the surface and say, yeah, but what's the real deal here? And to come up with an innovative method. And then critical thinking, using facts, not instinct, not bias. And I'm going to repeat this, using facts. In other words, again, especially in the business world, too often you'll hear people say, well, I just have a gut instinct about this. Well, that's fine as long as your gut instinct is not due to something you ate last night. The key thing is, and especially that it's not due to some you know, built-in bias that you've carried with you all these years because you've never tested it against anything. You just say, well, that's my gut and I go with that. Well, probably you've got, it's probably real and good because you have been using it for a lot of years. You probably would have been called on it before this if it were truly a bias that did not work for a lot of people. But the key thing is critical thinking using facts, and that's really more and more important today, right? So, the adaptability. Now, this one kind of flies in the face of that one of perseverance, but I say that it goes with it. The willingness to change if needed. You can have the greatest, perseverance, the ability, I'm going to keep pounding this. But, if it's a stone wall, pounding your head against it is not going to work. If you did not evaluate the issues correctly, perseverance isn't going to take care of it. You have to be able to use that critical thinking to go back and say, okay, the perseverance idea is so that I'm saying, yes, I'm going forward. Yes, this was an issue not of, I didn't have the issues wrong, we just didn't execute it right. So, but if we did execute it right, then I need the adaptability to say, okay, let's change this up a bit. I missed on this. Obviously, that's not the key issue. Negotiation, we're going to see this is the communication one on the other list, but it's the ability to work with others and to pull past conflicts. That's a very big one, right? Because so often we end up with those biases I talked about are built in because, well, I had a bad experience with this person last time I worked with them, or I had a bad experience with this rule or regulation. We need to be able to negotiate. We need to be able to put those things on the table on the side and say, look, we've got to work together to get this to work and to pull others with us because they're the ones that probably are more likely to be stopped by that previous issue. Now, the biggest one in my mind, on the business side, decisiveness. You can do all of the analysis you want, but if you do not act decisively on the information you got, doing all that analysis in the end is absolutely worthless, isn't it? You have to make a decision, you have to go forward with it, and it has to be at the right time. Making the decision half an hour after you should have, yeah, that might not, you might get lucky and it might work, but decisive. You need to make a timely decision based on the best info. And then I've added the integrity one. And of course, I look at that and go, do we really have to check for this? And the answer today is yes, we do. And remember what we got from Warren Buffett. His line was, if the person you're working with does not have that, just walk away. If they don't have that, you'll never get anywhere with this person and they may bring you down with them, right? So these are the skills that Buffett tells us that he was checking for, and we can see where they match up with the ones we've used in the past, right? These are the things I want you thinking about as we go forward. But we do have to think about what did you learn last time, right? Last time we were talking about what? Anybody remember? Yeah, and I know a number of you didn't make it here. Last time we were actually looking at the state side. We spent 3 classes where we looked at how the American Revolution came about, and more importantly, again, when they evaluated the situation, they said, we can't get there. All the perseverance in the world is not going to work. The Articles of Confederation will not work. The fact that one state can veto everything, it's never going to work. and they came together. They evaluated what was needed. They came together. They were decisive about it. They pulled other people along with them, all the other states, and pulled it off, right? And last time we looked, then, even though it was not necessarily part of that first group, it's really the logical step. We moved over and looked at the states and said, okay, what does the state bring to us, right? And in reality, what we saw was that after the Constitution passed, each state had to go back and develop a constitution modeled on the federal Constitution. And what we found was, to be part of the Union, each state was required to provide a representative form of government. Well, okay, we saw that all the states have the same structure as the federal Constitution. They have a legislative branch, they have an executive branch, they have a judicial structure. But I said that states favor weak executives. And the example I gave last time was that the governors are all term limited in almost every state, and I think they are in all states now. But but the bigger thing is, none of the governors have the true powers that the national executive has in the federal Constitution, right? And here's what I mean by that. All four of these offices that you see here in gold, those are the ones that are all elected individually. And what we see in all of the state constitutions is the voter is really, the concept of this is the voter is the king, right? Whoever gets the votes, then, the Secretary of State in the state system is not under the power of the governor. And we just saw it in Iowa. The auditor of the state is not under the power of the governor, although clearly the governor in Iowa thinks they should be, and has been trying everything to prevent that. What's the auditor do? Has to review every state department, every agency, and every local government. Plus, they have to review any group that gets state money. So all of those are kind of big things. Secretary of State, Commissioner of Elections, the person who tells you that your election was a legitimate election. They are not under the power of the state executive. The treasurer, the person who's paying the bills and getting the money, not under the power of the executive. The attorney general, the justice department in the states are not under the power of the governor. So in some ways, we can say this is a better structure. Now, all the other departments, then, those are all people appointed by the governor, and they answer to the governor. But, in this case, these are the things that are a key difference. And one of the big things, because we don't sit around and think about these things, one of the things that I just want to mention is, in asking what you learned last time, well, what's the difference? Okay, that's one thing that I just told you, but what powers does the state government have that the federal government doesn't? And okay, Article 10 or excuse me, not Article 10, the 10th Amendment tells us, whatever was not given specifically to the states, or excuse me, given specifically in the federal government, belongs to the states. But here's what this guy that we see pictured here had to say about it. The powers reserved to the states are all those objects that concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people, and the internal order, the improvement, and prosperity of the state. And the guy who wrote that was James Madison, the guy who really largely wrote the federal Constitution. So he's saying, life, liberty, and property are all the concerns of the state, right? And that goes back to that concept that, you want the closest government to the most, the one that's going to be most reactive to be there. So these are the things we talked about last time. And, what that all means, of course, is that the states have to provide protection. It's for the safety of the people, but not just the people, their property as well, right? What does it profit us? Well, I'm safe, but everything I had burned down. and thus we get into some of the regulations. Under that improvement concept, education is reserved to the states. Transportation services, in other words, roads and things like that, are generally part of the states. So fire and police services, building and housing regulations then are a protection method, right? Snow removal, flood protection, safe roads, taking care of the people in that way. Planning and zoning, restricting appropriate uses. And you might say, well, how's that important? Well, I want planning and zoning to be there because if I have a residential district, I really don't want somebody to have the right to build a hog lot next to me. By the same token, if I have a hog lot, I don't want somebody building a residential, development right next to my hog lot because sooner or later that's one of us is going to lose. So all of these things are important, right? But we go beyond these, of course. Senior citizen programs, community development has become a big thing. Planning and zoning, as I said, but also environmental protection. And if you think about it, what we need to think about, I'm sure you're all saying, well, gee, all those things you mentioned, Russ, are things that we hear the federal government doing. The water, worrying about, safe water, worrying about, runoffs, things like that. Why is that? Well, because as we can clearly see when we go back in history, the states have a habit of cutting corners on roads, on bridges, and of course on the one that Madison had. We talked about this a lot in those first three, the local majorities causing problems for minorities. And when I say minorities, I mean the ones that have fewer votes than the majority. Now, somebody brought out today, there's also just the actual aspect of that as well. Women certainly were equal in numbers, but for over 100 years, they, had no ability, to bring their issues to the floor. The same thing was true with slaves, and then we saw again slave states having a habit of cutting corners what they did after the slaves were free. So now the key thing is we try to get by where the feds use a carrot and stick method to incent good behavior. But sometimes that just doesn't work, does it? And most of us are old enough to remember this one, when, it was finally recognized that separate is not equal, and the states would not allow black children into white schools, even though the Supreme Court had said that they were overturning the doctrine of separate but equal. We saw local majorities, trying to terrorize and intimidate local minorities. Now, of course, we had an executive that acted, and he acted in a forthright manner, knowing full well that to, waffle in a point like this would be terrible. And he sent in troops into the South for the first time since the Civil War had ended. So, and sending them in, of course, they stayed until 76 after the Civil War. But, when I said carrot and stick, we have to remember that most of the executives since then have been very big on the idea of using the carrot, and money is that carrot. So, since the 1950s, we've seen money for transportation, and Ike himself did that, right? Here's the feds doling out some money so that we get an interstate transportation system, even though technically, the concept was that was under the states. But the big one that I always remember, was when even in the small towns, we got wastewater treatment plants. I grew up in Ponca, and I distinctly remember, and I remember going, oh my gosh, that's $7 million. Where are we going to get that? And it was clearly coming from the federal government. And was that important? Well, yeah, because like every other small town and large town, you just dumped it in the creek and let the creek wash it away for you, even to the detriment of everybody else. But we have seen since then all sorts of carrots. The senior health care, which of course 65, we'd call that Medicare and Medicaid now. School lunch programs, Head Start programs, underwriting educational loans. The concept that they started funding the concept of trade schools, which they then later morphed into community colleges. I don't know if we can think of any example of that. And of course, senior housing today and things like that. So by the way, when I say underwriting educational loans, what I'm really saying is what? That the federal government is underwriting that, not the state government, the federal government. So, it is federal money. Well, of course, it's taxpayer money. And why did we do this? You know, because we've got a piece of paper, and that's what we've been talking about these last few weeks. At a piece of paper with all these words on it. And as LBJ said, this is the first nation in the world to be created with the purpose that all men are created equal. These are not just clever phrases, they are a promise to citizens. And that means if the state will not act, the federal government must. And thus he did, even though he was a Southerner, even though he had been part of that group during his entire tutelage, right? But he also recognized that sometimes a stick was necessary. The most basic right of all is the right to choose your own leaders. And if you have states that are preventing that from happening, then every American citizen must have an equal right to vote. And why is that? Why do we worry about that? Well, the states have the ability to tax and spend. And I said that the one key thing that came down, all the Constitution says you can have a state and your state. The only thing we say is they have to be a Republican form of government. What they really mean is a representative form of government. Why is that important? Why does it have to be a representation? Because the entire concept of our revolution was based on what? No taxation without representation. It didn't say no taxation. It never said no taxation. It said no taxation without representation. And thus they're making certain, the whole concept being you have a Republican or representative form of government, so you are representative, you have a say. So these are the things we talked about. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on the rest of this, but I'm bringing it up because everything we're going to deal with today is based on the concept that these three states that we are, at the confluence of here, these three states are all based around the slight differences of the same rules. And we saw last week differences state to state. And while there were differences, it was really just in how it was executed. Oh, in this state, you need to do X, Y, and Z, but in this state, you have to do A, B, and C. And C is the same as Y, but A is slightly different than X, and, et cetera, et cetera. And what we found, of course, last week was those of us who have ran businesses or those of us who have worked for businesses in multiple states have learned you have more hoops to jump through. You have more places to trip up. You have issues sometimes, right? Now, we know that in our case, though, at the local level, you're dealing with generally a city or village board, a county board, and a school board. Those are the three governmental agencies that come down to you. There is a state over all of that, and they list out what you can do. And one of the big things is, as we'll see, what those local groups cannot do. The state is given the power to tax income. The counties are not. The counties cannot levy any tax unless explicitly authorized by the state. Thus, they get property taxes. And as we talked about, who do they share those property taxes with? The county shares them with the school board and the cities, right? Cities can try to pass a sales tax, and in some of these states, the county can join in with them or not. Now, one of the slightly gray areas that, depending on which state you're in, they can create TIF districts. And remember, I said those were tax increment financing. And you have to kind of watch those, because if you get too aggressive in using tax increment financing and saying, oh, well, this will help, you're going to come in and you're going to get rid of this blighted area. Because remember, to create a tax increment financing area, you got to be getting rid of something that is so bad it is truly blighted. That's what it says. And by doing so, then what happens is you're saying, we're going to freeze these taxes. Now, that's how it usually works. We're going to freeze the taxes at the level they are right now so that you don't get hit with the fact that you're going to improve all this. And we delineate what day that's going to come off where now you will get that. But your problem with that is, we need to think this through. What happens if you blighted this, you said this entire area is blighted, we wiped it all out, we put a huge plant in there, that plant brought in 2 or 3,000 jobs. Now they built a multi-million-dollar plant, but you gave them tax increment financing. Then all of a sudden, now you've got 2 or 3,000 jobs, so maybe you've got 3,000 or 4,000 kids that are suddenly going to be using your public schools. But your schools are not getting any additional money because you froze that tax at that lower level. And now all of a sudden you've got a problem, don't you? So we have to be aware that all of these things, they're trade-offs, right? Now remember, here's a big thing, and this is kind of interesting because it's worded differently in the federal level, but counties cannot regulate inside city limits if they're in conflict with city regulations. Counties cannot exceed state laws. So what I really want you to think about, the county is limited in what it can do, and the state's telling it that. I want you to think about this. One of the fights we are seeing today in the world today is in America today is the fact that the states are jumping up and saying, no, we control immigration. No, we control how we're going to decide, what we do on some of these things. And they're all, you've got the feds saying, well, no, that's our area. And they're saying not. Now, of course, in our world, what that means is it gets litigated and has to go to a Supreme Court. But remember what I also said last week, really and truly, if you honestly look at it, and this is true throughout history, it's not anything different today. Depending on the time and the era when the majority of the people were put on that court, those people, the rulings you get off a Supreme Court, they function as a slightly dim or dark mirror that reflects exactly the time frame that they were appointed. And that's just honestly the truth. If you go back and look through history, these people do not have the wisdom of Solomon and the strength of Zeus or anything else. I mean, this is just a reality. They're basing it off what they know. Now, maybe in some cases that means they failed part of our leadership test that said they should be a little innovative and thinking forward and evaluating what the true issue is as opposed to anything else. But they are limited. Their concept is they're not supposed to make up laws, and most of them don't. So just a reality there. We have to think about this. But my point is, where it's clearly delineated in your state constitution that this county cannot jump up and say, no, I'm taking over this job or this work, even though it's clearly the state's job. No, that rarely happens. Although I experienced in Sioux City on a business I was running, and I mentioned this last week, where the county auditor, an elected official, decided he was going to get creative in how he taxed, a piece that I had running through the right of way, and it was clearly he was evaluating it based on how much money my company was going to develop out of that, and no matter how many times we told him or told the board of supervisors, there was absolutely nothing anybody could do about it because the auditor is what? He's directly elected, right? And it had to go through the courts, and it finally got to the point where it was slapped back. But By that point, it was 3 or 4 years later. Everybody had spent an awful lot of money, and the state, I should say, excuse me, the county, the schools, in the city, all had to give the money back, and it was a sizable amount of money because they were basing it on how much money the company was making. And that's one of those creative regulations that you don't want to have happen because, if the business had had a chance, if it was the right type of business, it would have just picked up and moved somewhere else, right? So, and that brings to the point, nobody ever thinks about this. Look, we're not going to spend much time at this. I just want you to look. Voters, as I said, voters are king. You see they are at the top of this list. The voters directly elect the auditor, the attorney, the recorder, the treasurer, the sheriff, and the board of supervisors. Now, sheriff, treasurer, etc., you don't see it here, but they each have their departments. They each have their people who answer to them. But the board of supervisors, then we see, has all these other things that do answer to them. If it's a dark line, they have control over that group. Notice the board of supervisors has absolutely zero control over the sheriff, right? Zero control over the auditor. And if you really look at it, from everything below the red, those are dotted lines, which is another way to say the board of supervisors does not control these groups underneath it. They have the ability to put somebody on the board, but really that person is there to advise, suggest, and to report back to the board of supervisors saying, we might have a problem. Something else to look at, so much like we see nationally, where for years now, to get the states to go along with the fact that they were underfunding their schools, the feds give money to the states for schools. The state also provides funding for schools in addition to the local property tax dollars. I only bring this up because why do they do that? Why don't they just leave it with property taxes? Largely because then you would have a situation where well-off areas would have good schools, poor areas would have poor schools, right? Also, in the fact that if you did make it rely strictly on property taxes, what could happen is your property taxes could seem too high for people. If somebody's saying, well, this is what we've got to do, we're charged with taking care of these kids, we have to do a great job at it, and your taxes just doubled. Nobody wants to see that happen. So the state, in most cases, will give a cut to the school systems based on a formula, hopefully based on a formula, so that those schools who have a different budgeting time frame than the state does, so that they can get their budgets done with believing they know what they're going to get for money from the state. Notice what this trend line is showing us. Since the since the 70s, this has been on a downward trend, as far as money they're paying per pupil across the board. And this is just for your edification. This is what your state is providing per student. Okay. And this is K to 12. So, okay. Now, remember, the federal government is providing over 10% of the funding for your public K to 12, and post-public secondary schools are also kicking in a lot of money, and some of that is from tuition, and some of it is from their other funding sources as well, and from the feds. But the national gross domestic product grows at 13% faster than your public education budget does, just to say. And the reason I'm going back over all this is I don't want to forget Most of you know what Simcoe is, Siouxland Interstate Metropolitan Planning Council. You know, this region pioneered that concept, third oldest multi-state council of governments in the nation. They work across the state lines. It was suggested by Connie Bodine, who was Sioux City manager, I believe, at the time, and then went on to become a local elected official. First meeting was held in 65, and there were two big goals that they had on their plate right at that point, and they all worked across state lines. So it was absolutely vital that you had something that was pulling these together, but they were also working with up to 40 little different towns as well in each of these states. So what's happening, the two big issues off the start, one was they wanted that bridge. They had this idea, they wanted Highway 20 to be 4-lane across Iowa, and they wanted to make sure that it was going to connect to Highway 20 coming across Nebraska straight across. They wanted a bridge, and that bridge would take some years to develop, but of course that is our bridge that's down by the wastewater treatment plant. And the other issue, of course, remember what had happened in the 50s, massive flooding in this area. Simcoe took on not only the transportation issues, but Simcoe was deeply involved in the concepts of all the levees and dikes and everything else, the flood control projects, because of course they recognized building a flood wall on one side wasn't going to do anything for the other side, right? In fact, would possibly damage them because now there's no runoff going that way and could cause them problems. So again, both the transportation with bridges and with the local issues of flooding, those two things required lots of moving pieces between different states. And again, I'm bringing this up because that's really what we're going to be dealing with today as we talk about this. Right. With all of that, and of course, then in February of 1988, we had the first Tri-State Governors Conference. Now, I've mentioned in a previous class that we did have conference that had happened the last time, something that had happened where people were using the fact that they could bounce across different borders and get away from prosecution, and that was the 1932 farm strike, right? Well, nothing was instituted to make that a go after that. So in 1988, we have the first meeting of the Tri-State Governors. This is the picture of those folks, George Michelson, Kay Orr, and a very young Mr. Branstad. So with that, those folks were coming together to hear what local people were saying about the fact that we are located right at this point where multiple governments are, have some impact on a good portion of people from all three states. So with that, we're going to be running into tonight's program topic, Dakota Dunes, because that's exactly what it's about. And this Tri-State Governors Conference held in 1988 with people in the audience, me among them, but with people in the audience that had issues that they wanted to make sure that the governors and thus their staffs were aware of so that they could deal with them. All right. So I do have a question first, though. This was my true false question. So you think of all the news you hear, you think of everything you've heard about. True or false? Our dislike of the government is that they do too little. And what you'd hear immediately is pushback to that, right? Most people are saying false. No, they have too many rules, they have too many laws, they have too many thou shalt nots, there's too much red tape, blah blah blah, right? Well, I want you to realize that if you go back and look, there's broad public support for the federal government having a major role in a lot of different areas. keeping the country safe from terrorism, managing the U.S. immigration system, ensuring safe food and medicine. You know, depending on who you are, you may or may not agree with this, but notice 90% agree with that first one. The safe food and medicine, 82%. And remember, every time you suddenly hear that, oh, gee, we have allowed, these pharmaceutical companies to buy each other, and now we only have one place producing the pills, and we found out there's a problem with them. Suddenly that number goes up, doesn't it? Because people are saying, well, it shouldn't be that way. And that's true food and medicine. That's true with baby formula. That's true with all these others. We create the problems that we have, and we do that because we ignore or diminish that red tape, all those regulations, right? Strengthening the economy, that is a federal government job. Some people think they shouldn't have anything to do with it. Others say, no, thanks. I've lived through a couple of economic depressions. I'd rather not experience that. Thank you. So, and on through this list. Just realize maintaining infrastructure, ensuring access to healthcare, all of those things, people are saying, yeah, we think the government has a place in that. So, with that as our background, remembering that the easy answer sometimes is not the right answer, that fact that no, there's always too much government, there's too much this. And remember, I'm the first to say it. I remember when George Bush the younger took office, and one of the first things he put through was a reduction in paperwork act that had actually been in place or, coming up through the line. But he said, yes, we want to do this. And I have to tell you, as a guy that was running, a small business by that time, I was really happy about that. I was very thankful to have that happen, because there is too much paper. There are too many things we have to deal with, and it's frustrating. I get it. So remember, we're looking now, going forward, we're looking to identify leadership skills, to examine the use of those skills, and to show positive results. I'm not going to go back through this list, but we are at the point where now we're going to be looking at Dakota Dunes, and the concept when visionary leadership comes to the fore and it engages with innovative thinking and decisive action. So remember that date of that first Tri-State Governors Conference. It's rather interesting to think about. At exactly the same time, this is the picture, September of 1988, of the confluence of the Missouri and the Big Sioux Rivers. And we see that point there, heavily wooded and everything else. And of course, we notice as we look at that, there's a lot missing up there, right? There is no Dakota Dunes. This is well prior to anything happening. So, how did that come to pass? How did we get to the point where now, if you were to look at a map, you see something like this in that same area, right? We're going to be looking at how you develop, Dakota Dunes, how it came into being. So, what is Dakota Dunes? I always ask questions to get you focused. What is Dakota Dunes? Why was it developed? Who led the creation of Dakota Dunes? And I have to tell you, I was shocked because somebody in the audience actually had the answer, to why was it developed, at least the answer that was given at the time. And we're gonna get to that, but so be thinking of what your answer to that. Why was Dakota Dunes developed? And we're going to see. And one of the other things, back behind there, I'm really kind of going to be asking, how important is Russ Christensen to Dakota Dunes? And the last thing, going back to that question I was just asking, why was Dakota Dunes developed at all? What in the world, what, who, we have housing projects, we have developments that go in place all the time that say we're going to get together with the city government. We're going to say, I'd like to develop this tract of land for houses, et cetera, right? We do that all the time. But, generally they're entrepreneurs looking to, either create more money for themselves or and specifically in the housing market and the sales of these items and things like that. And remember as well, when you're doing that, you're working with a city that they know that, well, yeah, this is going to be an increase in tax value, and we're going to put in the infrastructure. We're going to be the ones putting in the roads. We're going to be the ones putting in the utilities. We're going to be the ones putting in all this stuff. So, there is a cost, but over time, it's a good thing that comes back to us. But, who's looking at developing Dakota Dunes? Why was it developed at all? So this is a picture of Russ Christensen. He joined Iowa Public Service following graduation from SDSU in 1959. He worked his way to the top when the merger uh, created Midwest Energy. He was president of IPS. We all remember Iowa Public Service. And he ended up underneath the new CEO, for Midwest Energy. But in early 1986, watch the dates, in early 1986, he replaced the outgoing CEO who was hitting 65 and decided he was retiring. Russ Christensen was 50 years old. You know, I think all of us in this room will say, yep, young guy, right? Okay, so here's the thing. I said, watch the dates. What's happening in Siouxland right at this time? What are you thinking about that? We have challenges, don't we? There's been a lot of changes. Farmers are in crisis thanks to high inflation. And part of that then is also driven by the fact that, some years before, the government had made a decision to embargo grain as a foreign policy tool. And of course, that was for the invasion of Afghanistan. And of course, what we, good or bad, what we found out, if you do a grain embargo, what you actually are doing is saying you can, if this goes on more than 2 months or 3 months, you can just kiss that entire um, avenue of revenue goodbye, because the people you have embargoed will find a different source, and those sources will then do everything they can to keep that revenue later. And also there's the fact that, knowing that you might think that their food aspect is a cudgel that you can bash them with, they may not be willing to come back to you anyway. So the early 1980s, it saw a farm recession where the financial crisis was affecting Midwest farmers, and they had heavy debt loads, right? Because all things were good. They were buying while, the money was good. And, the banks would write the notes. And then when the turn down came, um, you'd ended up with some high interest rates up towards around 21%, which then, was causing real problems, right? Record production, it resulted in a glut of farm goods, and it just was bad. Prices were going down. The export decline had gone down 20% from 1981, because of that embargo. So, you know, farm debt, had doubled, and people were having problems. And, remember that farm crisis was real during the 1980s. Minnesota, so we're talking Minnesota, lost more than 10,000 farms. And that's really not the right way to say it. Individual farmers, 10,000 individual farmers lost their farms. Somebody else bought them. Somebody else then turned around and made money with them. But those individual farmers were now out, or if they did stay in farming, they were now hired help, right? And, what we really found was, only a fast moving crisis promotes a quick political solution. The bankers are saying, well, we're not going to put a ban on foreclosures. What caused that farm strike in 1932 I talked about? Well, no, we don't want to alleviate anybody's debt. We don't want to, that's a debt. You signed for it. You should. Yeah. Well, when push comes to shove, sure, we'll do it, but not until the shove happens, right? So, um, and after a while, maybe there's nobody left to shove when you've lost all the farms. Here's the other thing, though, that goes with that. Technology was reducing the cost per bushel, so the market will start to improve. The dropping the embargo helps, but as I said, that's gone at this point. You know, when we, actually put in when Carter cut every, why did the Democrats run somebody against Carter in the 80 election, because Carter had jumped up and said, no, we gotta cut all the spending, and chopped all these Democrats were in charge of Congress, chopped all of those spending bills, all the pork barrels, and boom, it worked. It took years, but it worked. And that double digit inflation fever broke, but it wasn't easy, and it wasn't really over. But here's the big thing. Remember, in 76, we'd also saw the result of what happens when business gets what they want on regulations, and had, gotten the ability to say, no, no, we need cheaper labor. We need lower labor costs. We're an American company, so we're going to put our manufacturing overseas, and then we'll bring it back in. And since we're an American company, we don't have to pay tariffs. Um, and what, of course, that meant was Sioux City lost the Zenith plant, over 2,000 jobs gone, and what, 14, maybe 20 different cities throughout America had that same thing happen. But in Sioux City, an ag-based community, with these farm crisis issues in the early 80s, the double-digit inflation that was hanging on for dear life, and the Zenith closing, you know, early 80s, and by 86, all of a sudden, if you were in a business like I had, or a business like Iowa Public Service, Midwest Energy, where you have connections to homes where people live, when over 2,000 of those people just finally say, the economy's getting better elsewhere. I haven't got the house sold yet, but I'm just leaving. It's time to just leave. We have to give up. We have to have an income. And they just leave, and those hookups don't come back. You're not getting that money. At the same time, you had other wages declining, because you know IBP will have a kind of victory with the union, and then later in the 80s, completely break it. So you will have declining wages. That's just all there is to it. You know, with all of those things, the population plummets in Sioux City. And, we had the joke at the time, there was a housing glut. Yeah, you want to sell your house. You know, I happen to be looking for a house. I need a 3-bedroom. Yeah, what color do you want it? Which side of the street? There were so many houses for sale. It was a buyer's market, right? But we didn't have that many people moving in, because we didn't have the jobs that were there for them. So it is into this area that all of these things are happening. The housing starts are down, the sales of housing are down. The region is rapidly losing population. And I'm talking Sioux City. Well, what's happening to the small towns? All of the small towns are drying up. The kids are going off to college, and they're not coming back in the 80s. Unemployment's high, housing starts, as I said, down. You're faced with a struggling economy. What Iowa Public Service and Midwest Energy was seeing is gas and electric services, throughout their territory, was terrible. They were seeing further and further declines there on their own. And quote, he said, he came up with this project to keep the utility from just slowly withering away. But he knew when he did it, the project that he had in mind was not a sure thing. Now remember, I just said that it's 1986, and he's just become the CEO. He was already president of IPS, but now he's the CEO of the combined operation. And he's saying, I have to look to the future to see what it is that I need to do to turn things around. So he's analyzing those issues, right? And his idea is, we've got a unique situation here. You've got South Dakota very close to Sioux City. So you've already got the amenities of Sioux City. But if we could create a community in that area of South Dakota, looking at the fact that their tax rates are among the lowest in the nation. I think I said last week that it was like 5 or 6%. That was your total take. That was the state's total take of taxes for you, including the county, including property, etc. So as he would say, the attraction of South Dakota was obvious, you know, citing the lack of a state income tax and the state's overall business friendly climate. But it was also a gamble. Now, in all the things I read, he's saying it's a $250 million gamble. Now that's the entire accumulation of what's going to go into this project in the first phase being the first plateau, I should say. The part that his company would be coming up with would be 20 million. And of course, after saying 250 million, 25 million looks like, well, it's nothing. That's 10%. That's not nothing. And remember, in that era, it's even more of not nothing. Now, of course, he makes the claim that Iowa's income tax rates were among the highest in the nation and that they're chasing away many of the state's elite. Now, that's a statement that, okay, he's assessing the issues as he sees them. So, as he said, the attraction to South Dakota is obvious: lack of state income tax, overall business friendly climate. But key point being, the other piece, were they chasing away? Well, people were leaving. I don't know if they were leaving because of Iowa's tax rate, but they might have been at the levels that he existed. I didn't live at that level. I can't say that for certain, but there is a reality piece to it. Whether it's a full piece or not, I don't know. But, we got to remember this is wildland, and as Ted Waite, the guy that would end up as founder of Gateway, would say, this wasn't a place with nice, pretty, big houses. It's a place where we had keggers and people dumped their garbage occasionally. This is a picture of Russ Christensen out there in that area where they're going to be looking at, this is what it looked like. There's nothing, there's no development here. Well, speaking of which, then that's one of the things we have to look at, is here's that view again. This is from 1988. Notice there's nothing out there, and that nothing includes there's no interchange up there to get off at, right? You can get off at North Sioux. You could get off in Riverside and come through North Sioux at Military Road, but that's really not going to help. So there's some issues, and the fact that everybody knows this area as a place where maybe they went out camping, or as you heard from Ted Waite, maybe where the kids went out to party, maybe where you went fishing. And it's much like the banks of the downtown Sioux City, Missouri River, which it's a wide open space. So what did it get used for at some point or another? A public dump. There were two of them here in the past. So, as he said, there's a lot of quietly spoken skepticism. Now, this is from one of his last interviews when he says that, but he said this next line: at the time, it was going to be the best idea, or it was going to be the worst idea we ever had. And I just want you to think about that. I do find it rather amusing. If you look at that, it was going to be the best idea. He doesn't say we. It was going to be my best idea or the worst idea we ever had. But his point was, and his point was legitimate. Remember what I said about this being a gamble. It wasn't going to fall anywhere in between. If this didn't work, if it wasn't going to work, that 20 million could be invested and you get nothing out of it. Nothing, period. So that becomes a big issue. And who's looking at that? It's not, Russell Christensen that is thinking about ponying up that money. He's recommending that to his company that he is CEO of. And of course, that will actually be through a third company that they create, Midwest Energy Corporation, that they will fund with money, because you don't want to have it coming out of the same pockets um, where you're getting those hookups and getting your money from, because utilities have regulations, things they have to provide with the money they get since they are a utility. Here's the thing, we need to look at this. There are two major problems here. And, he's not a Pollyanna. He evaluates these issues and he knows that this is an issue. Problem, number one, 1,500 acres of this land belongs to Dakota County, Nebraska. And you say, well, how can that be? It's on the other side of the river. And no, the river had changed course and it put the land over on this side. And for years, Union County and Dakota County, Union County, South Dakota, Dakota County, Nebraska, had been fighting over this. Dakota County was not giving up their rights to it, saying, hey, this is ours. Come on, kick back. This is the way it is. And I want you to remember something. Convincing states to give up something is a daunting idea. Some of you are old enough to remember, the Winnebago Native tribe would fight this through the 1960s because of a change in the course of the river that had deposited a chunk of their reservation on the Iowa side, and of course that's how you get Winnevegas too. But remember, it took them over 20 years of court cases to ever get that resolved. So the fact that this is up there and that's a problem, that's a big problem, right? And another problem is that interstate exchange that I talked about. Realize that while it's changed today, we do see, whereas towns are spreading out, if you have the right situation, the right people, all of a sudden they will kick out and make a new interchange. But at the time of this, it was going to cost around $3 million at least. And that was not something that you just whistled up and said, hey, South Dakota, hey, feds, we want you to build an overpass right here, an exit right here. You do that, right? You'll do that for us. Just boom. These are two things that have to be addressed, and they are going to require negotiation. They're going to require clear thinking, and they're going to require contacts to make these things happen. This is that evaluation of the issues, deciding what are we really facing, what is the situation, and what is our gamble? What's that based on? And here comes another question then. What's a lifelong engineer know about laying out a city? If he's saying, I want to create a city, because if you think about it, what he's really saying is, I want to create a city and I want it laid out so that it's going to have high end lots, but we're going to have roads, we're going to have infrastructure, we're going to have all the utility hookups, not just ours, but water and sewer and everything else. And well, wait a minute, what's it take to build a sewage treatment plant? How's that going to work? What are we going to do here? You know, he he's not a city planner. He was a lifelong engineer, but he was also, well, I should say he was a trained engineer, but he was an experienced lifelong business manager. And he did know the importance of getting the best help. Now, I will mention, when we talked about different leaders at times, he had passed through that leadership training program that we had talked about Mary Barta going to as well. That taught, that's an intensive training program that not just anybody gets into. You got to have a lot of smarts and you got to have a lot of ability. And one of the things that he knew was the importance of getting the best help. Remember, I said he's newly installed as president and CTO. He's got his own job. His job is communicating that vision that he has and selling it, and not selling it. You don't want to sell it. Convincing. I need them to, look at the same things I'm looking at and come up with the same answers. Because sooner or later somebody's going to say, we're in the heat and electric business. We're not in the city planning business. We're not in the development business. Why don't we have somebody doing that and we just come up and give them the items? And of course, his answer to that is, if not us, who? If not us, when? So, you know, now he's thinking of spending 20 to 25 million in it, and knowing that you reach a point as you're developing this, that now suddenly other people are going to come forward with their money. He very clearly believes that this will end up as about a 200 to 250,000 taxable value for this land. So there's also the question of what's it going to cost us to procure it, and we got to kind of keep it quiet, right? Because if we're out there buying it, and we've seen this happen in our lifetime where somebody else has come in to say, oh, we want to buy all this, and suddenly the price goes up and you have people that won't sell until they get top dollars. So they're keeping it hush hush through all this too, which then, is another loophole, or excuse me, another way that as a leader you can get bound up, because you can't put all your cards on the table and you have to be careful of that. How do you get somebody else in there to help you? And in this, the city of Sioux City helps him in an immensely beneficial way. In early October, the Sioux City City Council had a meeting with their then city manager. Now, their city manager was named J.R. Kastner, extremely intelligent and innovative person. When he'd been in charge of things at Ames, he'd actually said, we got all this waste material. If we burn that, we can create electricity. We can, or whatever it was they were, we can get something out of that. He was an innovator. He was somebody who could look at things and say, okay, what's that take? Find the right answers, get the right things, everything else. And what had happened was, there were only two things. He was doing a great job with the city of Sioux City, and everybody knew that. And he was very, very pro business. And the people in the business community, myself included, enjoyed working with him. He was somebody you could go to and, hey, let's figure out an answer. It's not, no, you can't do that, or yes, you can do this. It's, well, let's see what we can do to make that happen. And, he only had two problems facing him, as far as being successful as a city manager. And unfortunately, both of them were sitting on the city council. One of them was an ex city manager, and of course, you know how that works. I always have the best ideas and more intelligent. That guy's name was Connie Bodine, and genuinely a very intelligent guy. And the other one was Lauren Callender, who really was not necessarily that enamored of the entire uh, city manager form of government. So between those two, remember, there's only 5 people in the city council in Sioux City. If you've already got 2 votes against you, no matter what, all you got to do is annoy one person and you're out. And in early October of 1986, I believe, Kastner's called into a meeting before a city council meeting, and they tell him that we've lost faith in your ability to do what it is we want you to do, and it's a closed meeting. And as he said, well, my question is there something I can do to regain that faith? And the answer was pretty much no, really, we don't think so. And so he came out and resigned. Now, um, in reality, he came out and resigned rather than, being fired. Interestingly enough, the timing was perfect. And Russ Christensen, immediately got in touch with him, discussed what he was looking at, And at the end of the month, so this is on about the 6th of the month when he ends up out of a job. And most of us remember all the, at that time you had a revolving door on the city manager's position, and generally 2 years and out was about it. He had done well to be there for 4. But quite often, the city manager moves on. Then after he's out of a job, he's got to go somewhere else. There's only one city manager, right? It's not like you're going to get a second city manager job. And the interesting thing being then that, with this, you know, Christensen offers him a job, and they don't say anything about it immediately. And Christensen, who's going to be uh, moving in as new boardman for the Chamber of Commerce, at the Chamber of Commerce meeting, the annual meeting is on the 30th of October, and during his address, Russ Christensen then says, "By the way, I'm just announcing that J.R. Kastner has joined Midwest Energy, and he will be, working as an industrial development capacity." And the entire group broke out in applause. Um, Kastner was genuinely admired, liked, respected at the least. Let's put it that way. He could be, like anybody else in charge of something, he could be thorny. Um, and again, when you have intelligent people, you put 2 or 3 of them in the same room, and of course, things. It's not always good things that happen, right? So, but Kastner has the smarts, he's got the contacts, and he definitely has the persistence to make deals happen. He's got the personality. Um, it was, a situation that was perfect, and Christensen seized that opportunity and announced it to everyone. And that is a positive thing. And what we now know later is Kastner immediately was put to work on this concept of creating, because if Russ Christensen hadn't been involved specifically in city planning, well, J.R. Kastner had. And thus, he is immediately going to work on this problem and this issue. 2 years later, August 4th, 1988, at a press conference in Sioux City, downtown Sioux City, Midwest the concept of Dakota Dunes. In his announcement, he would put out that we have 2 beautiful rivers that create the setting of a compatibly compatibly blend business, recreational, and residential facilities. And that's his statement at the news conference. Now, for a lot of us, who are looking at this, and many people, of course, know the Big Sioux as an even muddier version of, the Muddy Mo. Some of them are wondering maybe what he's smoking, but and especially the ones that know that point as, a big sandbar, right? But he's got a vision. And as we saw, I'm just going to step back to this, that concept by now, 2 years later, it's saying $300 million project. Now, it's not them putting out 300 million. They're still going to put out 25 million, but that's a chunk of change. And it's all private money. This is not coming from the state. This is not coming from, a federal agency. This is coming from a private group. They don't have to jump through hoops. They don't have to jump through red tape. They don't have to do anything else. They can do this. It's just that those problems that we mentioned do have to be addressed. And of course, those are just the big problems. So what he announces, of course, is what we come to know as the Dunes. It is going to be, a mixed use development encompassing over 1,800 acres. It's going to include an 18-hole golf course, a man-made lake, 216 acres of a business park, General commercial area is going to have about 40 acres. The club residence, and you're going to have, 1 acre and half acre lots that people can buy and build on. And of course, it's going without saying the fact that and if you live up here, you're not taxed on most of these items. 8,700 square feet for the cottage lots, some multifamily residences. They've got all of these pieces. It is a concept. You know, if you think about that piece of paper we just saw on for those of us who have been involved in anything in Sioux City, how often do you announce something that's going to be a really good deal and you get universal approval from the paper, from the state government, from the local governments, from everybody else? Ironically, out of that newspaper, if you read the 2 pages they give to them, it is all positive. The only people who are quibbling are, of course, the people, at the board for Union County, South Dakota, because they're bringing up, well, just for the record, 1,500 acres of that, you know, we're having a dispute over that with the state of Nebraska, and nothing's going to happen until that's fixed. And there's also the part of that those people at Union County are a little miffed to them. Nobody had said a word. This had all been played very close to the chest. So, with that, there are things that have to happen. And one of those things, what's it going to take to get those two problems fixed? How long? What's that? What kind of time frame are we talking about? Are they even fixable? Is anybody going to go along with this? Then beyond that, you know, are there people out there really looking for these high end lots? Are there really people who want to build major um, investments in a house to be next to a golf course? Can't we do that somewhere else? Are there people who are going to take up all of this to make the overall work? They're breaking it into groups and into sections, but there's that question. And this is not somebody who's going to say, oh, I've got a gut instinct. He's saying that, but Russ Christensen is then, he's had his talk with J.R. Kastner. They've been exploring these things. They've looked at it. Now it's moving farther than that, and they get they get a research firm involved, and they're going to go out and find out, because at the same time, Russ Christensen has announced this so we can find out, okay, is the state going to work with us? Who's going to be shooting at us? Is the state of Nebraska going to refuse, to work with us on Dakota County because, well, you're not doing it with us. Why should we help you with that? At the same time, who else is not going to be happy? Will people just go, yeah, I don't think so. I'm not really that interested. Who wants to live on a sandbar up there? And wow, how much money are you talking for these places? Are you kidding? So he puts that research group to work on it. Remember, this was, I think, August 4th that they announced everything. And by 4 months later, Midwest Energy has created a corporation and says, we're going for it. We're in for the money. We're going to provide you with this. We believe you are right. This agency's come back and said there will be a market. There will be people who want to live there. You can make this happen. And of course, we've also started getting feedback from the states, from the groups. There are people that want to work in it. It doesn't look like anybody's jumping up to block it. That's J.R. Kastner standing there, by the way. He, because of course, Russ Christensen has a company to run. Really, this J.R. Kastner is going to be lead man, at least in the public, for a lot of these things. And people are used to working with him. People are comfortable working with him. So with all these things, it's still Russ Christensen that's coming forth to say other items we're going to do, the things we've got, but in the public, the person that's out there, doing the retail work is going to be J.R. Kastner. And probably some of us in this group, probably had dealings with him because we were people he was talking to. Here's what Midwest Energy Corp said. We chose to locate in South Dakota largely because of its attractive business climate. The state imposes no corporate or personal income tax, no personal property tax, or business inventory tax. In addition, South Dakota boasts of a no red tape business location policy and offers several incentive programs to businesses relocating there. Because we are moving into that era where economic development is becoming a big deal, and these states are starting to move forward and pony up on it. And here's somebody saying, we're not looking for your money, we're looking for your help. Now, what's going to be created is the dunes will become an unincorporated master planned community. What the heck does that mean? Well, we know what unincorporated means. They're not going to be a town, right? Well, there's some interesting things. And master planned, whenever we're talking about a master planned community, we're saying, we want to create a community. We don't want the red tape of necessarily a village board that can tell us what we can't do. And we want to invest in other amenities that will drive this. And of course, the big first one that's going to get a lot of notice is the idea that we're going to create a world class 18-hole golf course utilizing that attraction of the river being right there. And we're going to Arnold Palmer to design a championship golf course. Now, this next line always cracked me up for that era. The 1980s. It named, Golf Digest will name the course when it's built the best in South Dakota. Well, okay, and your point, but it's going to have a 20,000 square foot clubhouse. It's going to have dining and banquet facilities. It's going to have a pro shop. It's going to have a snack bar. It's going to have enclosed year-round swimming pool, tennis courts, right? Those are those amenities we're talking about. And of course, remember, if you're looking for 1 acre lots with houses that are in the upper range of costs, those are the amenities people want. So master planned community is a large scale residential neighborhood, right? With a large number of recreational and commercial amenities. As I said, golf courses, tennis courts. These were not the norm at the time. They were starting to come in areas like Nevada, somewhere near, the areas that might draw people. Definitely Utah, definitely Arizona, some places that had, some style, some panache. Here, one doesn't really think of those things in terms of Sioux City, right? That master planned community, would include this, a hole right there with the river right there on the side. Now, all these things are coming together. They were able to get Arnold Palmer out here to look at it and say, yeah, that concept of those dunes, those huge white sand dunes that are out there. Yeah, we're definitely, yeah, I can see that. We have to go in an opposite direction to make that work, but you know what? We can do this. He got interested and excited about it. And in addition, the state legislature quickly passed legislation establishing Dakota Dunes as the first community improvement district. Now, what's that mean? That means South Dakota is giving them quasi governmental powers. They do not have to elect a board, they are the board. And as that community, then they can perform nearly all the public functions of a community, of a city, such as operating water and sewer systems, roads, parks, as well as a limited amount of levying taxes. Those are big things. And the state legislature in South Dakota just went, yep, check. But of course, that's always been one of the things with South Dakota. They did the same thing when City Corp approached them about the idea of using South Dakota as their home office if South Dakota would pass certain laws that would put the rate on the credit cards at a level that they were willing to live with and then not go back on that deal, which they didn't. So we start to see that this first master planned community in South Dakota, it's the only one within a 100-mile radius of Dakota, and they begin purchasing property in July of 1988. Now I have to tell you, my assumption is they had already put in place a lot of looks at that property, probably put in place agreements with confidentiality clauses and things like that. And of course, remember, July 1988 is prior to the announcement of the project. So if the project goes through, they can go ahead and make this work. So by September of that same year, before they had actually agreed to everything, because I said that was December, Midwest Energy Corp had bought nearly 2,000 acres and formed a Dakota Dunes development company. Now, remember though, before development can commence, we got an obstacle that's got to overcome, and this is not an easy one. I'm gonna skip past this slide. They've got a number of obstacles, and that biggest one is that boundary problem. Now, you want to talk negotiation skills? To get that boundary problem, that idea of Nebraska and South Dakota coming to an agreement as to that land, to get that fixed, it required approval from legislatures in both states. It had to pass both legislatures in Nebraska and in the House and Senate in in South Dakota. It had to pass both houses of Congress, and then it had to be signed by the President of the United States. So he announces this in August of 1988, and it is finished by May 18, 1990. And this is a picture of then Governor George Michelson displaying the congressional agreement that made this happen. Obviously, negotiation skills are certainly part of his deal. I'm going to go back and pick up these two slides. I think I got it out of the way. With that, they're going to start putting this together. And one of the aspects that team that had looked at it for Midwest Energy was, we're finding that doctor, utilize the nature of South Dakota, that we were already seeing in Sioux Falls, and create a health community aspect. And of those, of course, they're going to very quickly, as they get this built, as it goes forward, they will start providing, local jobs. So by the year 2000, Dakota Dunes is going to be putting out 1,500 jobs, and those are not lower income jobs. They are jobs in the medical field, in the rest of this. And remember the other things, do they really want to have their own water treatment plant? No. They convinced Sioux City to treat this planned community sewage, and they make a deal that until just recently stood the test of time and worked for both sides. And they also get South Dakota to build that interstate exchange. In fact, it's remarkable that new interchange will also take only 2 years from the moment of that announcement. It is just 2 years, and you have a $3.3 million interchange in place. So now the idea of, I'd said persistence is important. I want you to hear one of the lines that Russ Christensen would say. This is not a short-term project. This project has to have commitment, persistence, and vision that looks out over 10, 15, or 20 years. It is not a project for the weak of heart or the weak of pocketbook. And that is from that initial press conference. And he said it's going to require the cooperation, cooperation, what a concept, of local, county, state, and federal entities. And he included the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And the Army Corps of Engineers responded saying, yeah, we really do need to look at that because we have some dikes on that property that you're talking about that, we're going to need to evaluate and see what we're doing. It comes off. The point is, all of it works. As you saw, we start getting doctors locating there. We get groups locating there. Of course, IBP would eventually locate their corporate office there for many of the exact reasons that they put this together. And all of that is putting them well past those job numbers that they had predicted. Now, at 10 years, they're starting to do additional things. They add the Prairie Network, which, they're moving into smaller homes. They're moving into some multi-dwelling homes. They're doing some other items. Now, with all of that, that again is that concept of vision. None of this was, oh, we got to change this up. These are all things that were in process, things that they knew that was a direction they were going for. And at 25 years, this master plan community would sell its 1,000th house. And one of the comments that's made by the people doing that, when they started the dunes, there was a taxable value of $2 million in that area. We're now approaching 400 million. And the next 25 years, we believe that's going to grow to $500 million. Well, we'll see about that, but yeah. And as we saw in the news just late last year, there is a tract under development at Dakota Dunes, now at 35 years, and it's one of the last tracts of lands remaining. It's outside that original planned area, and it's a little different than what it was going to be, but still, even at 35 years, it has continued. Now, are there challenges? Yes. Are there some things that didn't work? Yes. Are there things that worked early on that now are kind of breaking down, which might be the boat club, might be the, that area around the golf course. Remember that golf course, did what it was supposed to do. They built it. They had a PGA, top event, the Ben Hogan tour, and they continued to work to make those things go. They met every goal. They, as I said, they would draw IBP's corporate office over. They created a thriving medical community. They built that planned retail center. They would draw the TV stations over there. They would draw, different groups, and they would pull that together, and they would continue to sell the housing projects, and it worked. They easily met that outside investment money that Christensen had expected. And remember, he had argued that giving the region a high-end home option with unique amenities in a tax-free location would stop the flight of upper-income people from the region. And he had a bit of an interest in that, right? Because he grew up, between Jefferson and North Sioux, somewhere in that area. And as I said, he's a South Dakota boy. Now, of course, the irony for him was about the time this was finally going. And I don't think I said it, but I mean, while Gateway Computers does not end up as directly part of this, it does, Dakota Dunes does benefit from that when Gateway moves from the Gateway International Airport, from the hangar they were working out of there, to move up to North Sioux again for that inviting business climate. And of course, people will live down there. And of course, Norm Waite will actually buy the very first house at Dakota Dunes, the first property place, even before Russ Christensen. So, my question is, did it achieve the goals? What defines success in a venture? And remember that bit that I said that it really has to be a win for lots of people. It can't just be a win for the one person. And, I think this is a win for the region. It's a win for the area. Is it still in the same ballpark of what it was 35 years ago, that's something we need, to look at. But is it worse than what it was? Did it cause problems? Did it, you know, up, did it strain the transportation system in any way? Um, I don't really think so. So the question, to get back to these were the three questions I'd ask you to start with. What defines success and adventure? How important is a leader to that success? How important was Russ Christensen to this? You know, it was his take on this idea, and the ability to say, yeah, I'm looking at it, and yeah, it's a lot of money, but I am going to act decisively. I am going to request that money. Yeah, is that my future I'm putting on the line if this doesn't work? Probably so. That's a failure that you probably won't overcome. But he believed in it strongly. Now, of course, the sad thing is, I think as it was coming up on its 10-year anniversary, he would give a couple of interviews, but he had been diagnosed with cancer and would not live. I'm certain he didn't live to the 15th, but he did see it succeed. He did see it go forward. It easily meant the outside investment money. Remember what I said, that 20 million that gets it started. That agency that did the look at it said, yeah, you're going to be spending a lot of money on starting the roads, getting it laid out, putting this together, but once you get this going, then all the other money is going to come in and it's going to propel itself. You're not going to be putting more money into it, and then you're going to be getting those returns on the things that you were building it for. The payback for some of the land you bought and things like that, plus the payback of all those hookups you were looking for. So, again, in giving that region the high end home option with unique amenities and a tax free location, he did stop that flight of the upper income people from the region, didn't he? At least for the time being. So, in that time when we saw massive flight from Iowa, or from Sioux City specifically, and remember, this is at a time when the entire Great Plains is emptying out. Remember what I'd said, that your small towns were drying up because the kids are leaving. Nobody ever talks about it, but if we had not had the immigration rate that we had, you know, the five Great Plains states would have lost population. And you lost seats in the legislature, i.e., you lost representation, not because you lost population. You weren't losing population, but you weren't growing as fast as the bigger cities. So you lost your percentage. You lost a couple of seats in Congress. You lost, those things. And that's a big deal. Imagine what would have happened if you had actually lost population instead. These are the kinds of things that change that, right? So there's a view of the river, and that amenity of the golf course. I submit to you that we really did see visionary leadership executed well by somebody who knew what they were doing, who had a vision, who executed that vision and made it happen. And I often talk about situations where people find themselves in a situation, and I say, well, did they shape the battle or did the battle shape them? He brought the battle to the situation. He said, no, I am not willing to see this company that I've got dwindle away, as he put it. He took the battle to them. He took the risk. He took the risk of his future, by saying, yeah, I just became CEO, but if I mess up on this, I can bet I'm not going to be CEO after this. So, as I said, this is that case when innovative thinking and decisive leadership come together. And, with that, you know, with that, you know, that's a pretty big thing. And I just want you to think about this. When I was giving this at the college today, I said, I want you all to look around. What was on top of this hill in 1966? Grass. We were up at Western Iowa Tech. You need to think about the fact that some similar issues happened over the development of that entire college, into an area that did not embrace the idea that when this school was changing from a trade, area to maybe a community college, yeah, the Chamber of Commerce didn't jump up and applaud. The rest of these places didn't applaud. That requires leadership to see that way through. And I guess I just want you to think about the fact that there's a reason why this lecture series is named in honor of Dr. Robert E. Dunker. And yes, while he stood on the shoulders of giants, he too became one of those giants to make a change and a difference, and to make it possible that we're even doing talks like this. So, realize leadership happens everywhere. And people have the option as to whether to embrace that, to take the battle forward, or to say, I'm doing okay. I don't care. I'll just let it go. So I'd like to give a special thanks to Dr. Robert E. Dunker for his example in leadership in creating what Western Iowa Tech Community College has become, and specifically for the lifelong learning program, and for his ongoing support for this program. So, all of you, I hope you realize, while we may have been spending a lot of time talking about somebody who's definitely, a certified visionary leader, we have one of those people in our midst right now, too. So, I hope we have identified some leadership skills, that you saw how those skills could be used, and we saw positive results of good leadership as well. It makes a difference. With that, folks, we've made it to the end of my program, and I just want you to note 15 minutes early. How often does that happen, huh? Come on. So, folks, that's it for my part of this program. I do see I've got another note here in the chat, so I'm going to check that. Folks, certainly unmute. I would love to hear any questions, any thoughts. If I got something completely wrong, tell me. I know there are more people, definitely more people involved in this than just those two. But that is one of the problems, and we need to spend time, really, to spend time thinking about these things, to see those people that did things, so that when that issue comes up again, there's somebody else who can say, well, this is what they did. Maybe we ought to be looking to step up too. So, with that, questions, thoughts, anybody out there? Did I lose all of you?
Can you hear me?
I can hear somebody.
Okay, this is Bob Peterson.
Yes.
Okay. I joined Midwest Energy in 1985. I worked directly for Russ Christensen, and one of my main missions, I had other assignments as well, but one of my main missions was economic development. You did a very good job of describing this. I was with Security Bank before that, and it broke my heart after growing up in a farm in Nebraska. It broke my heart to see those combines drive away and a defeated farmer walk and truly with the sunset and the sunset of his life as he knew it. But anyway, that was a good description, and I really appreciate that. Then soon after that, I formed an area in our office to do economic development, and part of it that J.R. Kastner would, since he was an acquaintance and apparently a friend of yours, wouldn't have mentioned, is that he actually worked for me rather than Russ. Although we had a very Russ and I had a very trusting and good relationship, and we tried to get the best we could out of the assets that we had. You had a few things they made sense in your presentation. They didn't make any major difference, but there were several things that what came first, what came second, and so on. West Energy existed before 1985.
Okay.
So it was a holding company for the utility and then also for the non-utility assets. Okay. Another thing that most people don't know is that it's a long story, and I'd love to tell it to you, but I one of the assets that was purchased was the Donovan Company out of Minneapolis, or actually St. Paul. And they were a construction company. They had a little gas company and so on. And in any event, I recommended to Russ that we sell the propane portion of that. That generated $50 million for us to use in Midwest Energy. That was now we also the 25 million. I've got a thing on my bookcase here that commemorates the closing of the bond issue. It was a municipal bond issue for $25 million that we did through an outfit in Minneapolis. But anyway, those are things that happened along the way. One of the things that we utilized, and I don't know how well, Jr. really intensively disliked me
Oh,
personally.
oh,
And one of the things that we did, though, was that because he had the ability and also reveled in the publicity, was that he
yeah,
would be
yes.
front.
Okay.
And it worked pretty well.
Yeah.
And uh, I, my name never came up in this, which is
Yeah.
kind of by design. I
I was going to
wrote
say, I suspect that was by design because, when I researched this, I did not stumble across your name. Seriously.
my name is on every plat for uh,
Sure.
every uh, uh, lot that's developed out there. Also, the prairie area came a little earlier than you thought, but again,
Okay.
nothing significant there. I remember when we got the SID passed through the legislature.
Hmm.
One of our allies was the senator from Union County, and just a little. He actually was not very complimentary of his fellows at the state when he said that most of them didn't know what they were doing. And the other thing is that the purchase of all the land, a friend of mine, a former boss of mine, a guy named Bill Wilkie, was between jobs, and Bill was hired to purchase all of those parcels. I think we did 32 of them or something like that. Bill then went on to be the president of a home loan association in the Quad Cities. I don't remember which one of the Quad Cities, but he was a great guy
Yeah.
and a good friend all along. The other thing is that uh, in the let's see, I wasn't taking notes, so I'm trying to look up my memory. Oh, I know there was a meeting with Governor Mickelson and the head of the South Dakota Traffic Highway Department. I don't remember what their name was, but anyway, we came to ask for the interchange.
Hmm.
And the guy that was with the highway department said, well, there can't be an interchange there. It has to be separated by 1 mile. And we said, yeah, that can happen. And he said, yeah, but there's no traffic count. We,
Yeah.
we can't get a traffic count that's adequate. And JR said, well, if that was the case, you'd only have one interchange in South Dakota. Unfortunately, George laughed. He was instrumental in so much, and he laughed, and that was the end of that.
Yeah. That is perfect. That is perfect. I'm just going to ask, have you done any kind of an oral history with the Sioux City Museum?
No, I've had a varied career. I left uh, when we went through the merger that merged IPS with the utility in Des Moines. That was in 1990.
Okay.
Soon after
I have
that,
that number wrong, so that's okay. Thank you.
yeah, again, immaterial, really. But after that, um, uh, there were five senior officers in Midwest Energy, and I was one of them. I handled the non-utility stuff. And Russ became CEO of the whole organization, and the other CEO got my job. And it didn't. I was pretty full of myself at that point, and it didn't sit very well. So, not really proud of that. But I left the company soon after that.
Well, my point is, it would be, the way, the only way, I spent more time researching this than I thought I would, and largely because since it was a private organization, there's far fewer things that are accessible to me on a fast level, and those that are kind of, you know go across the, I had to pull some things together and make some decisions, and
And
I hope
you
I
did
got it
extremely
right.
well.
But
You did
um,
extremely well, Russ. And I would say that I have started to write a book about it. And
great.
then it became apparent to me that it was inconsequential. And if it was written and published, it would also be self aggrandizement. And I don't need that. I'm almost 80 years old. Again, that picture that I will send you of the first foursome, um, it makes a powerful statement to me, and that is, I'm the only one still alive.
Yeah, absolutely
And
true.
I don't want to say some of these things either. Well, first of all,
Yep.
it's of no consequence to me what the public may what the public may. But one of the things that you also might think of including is the contribution of Dennis Melstead. Dennis is retired, lives in Sioux Falls now, where his kids live. And Dennis was the manager of the Dunes after kind of all the dust settled. He's
Okay.
the one that managed us through that flood. I was gone by then,
Yep.
but that was a major flood. That was what, 11?
Yep, that was 11. And I don't have it on my notes, because one of the things that I did mean to say is, of course, that set things back. They did not, the sales the next couple of years were a lot lighter than they expected. So yeah, it was a major flood, and yet that is also an example of overcoming, something as well. So I
One of the
yeah.
things that I would submit to you is that in the business of economic development, we never went into these things with the idea of making money.
No.
It would have been an accident if it did happen. We worked very closely with, I mean, again, IPS went over to Waterloo. We worked with everybody in between on things like, well, bought the railroad, that kept a lot of electric motors working in a lot of those towns.
Ah,
And the um, the thing about economic development, it was so fragmented that when David Blair and JR went someplace, I think it was Ohio, to look at a community, they came back with the idea of putting houses on the north side of the boat club. Yeah, if you remember, there was just vacant land
yep.
north of the boat club. And one of JR's major contributions is that he negotiated, and with Russ too, but he negotiated the deal, quote unquote, with the boat club, which
Yeah.
was he was intimately knowledgeable about it because, after all, the boat club was in trouble financially, and it was a good deal for them.
Yeah.
So,
But they rejected it the first time, and his
yeah,
line coming back was definitely, then I guess you're not going to be part of this. And they ended up coming back. So that's great. And thank you so much for your insights. I really appreciate it. And seriously, you leave. You don't want the book, you don't want the book published, but that is invaluable information for those of us who are trying to figure out how it went down. So
I'll
seriously,
try
that
to do better. Can you give me your email address? Just a second. I need to get a piece of paper.
okay.
Russ,
Yes.
why Bob's getting some writing utensils. Um, you mentioned a couple different times about the incentive for developing over there, and emphasize the tax structure. Well, now that we've come now 35 years later, two of the biggest corporations that were out there, Gateway and Tyson, obviously one it no longer exists and the other one pulled up stakes. So and Bob certainly can chime in on this too, is that the incentive, the tax incentive, as powerful today as it was back then? And the reason I say that is because a lot of the deals now, that I hear about and read about, they talk about incentivizing, like CF Corporation and some of these other things, companies that aren't going to be moving anyway, and they get lots of tax money to stick around. So, in other words, is the low tax, no tax incentive still as powerful as it was in 1988 or 1986?
Well, in a world that I've certainly experienced where, you continue to diminish the number of jobs based on, each group eating the next group and then saying, oh, we don't need those positions, where you have fewer and fewer home offices, obviously it's not going to be as great. And of course, you saw specifically that, when Gateway engineered the concept of buying, e-machines and then turned around and did the unheard of, which is saying, oh no, e-machines, we're keeping all of your, uh, you know, uh, CEO and your board members and everything else, and we're the ones going away because you're already located in California. One of the aspects that I struggle with as somebody looking at history and everything else is trying to figure out, you know, Sioux City existed when this was the home of the people who had come out here and made the effort and everything else. But now that we've moved into an era where you're much more mobile, think about it, how much of Sioux City is driven by the fact that, you got to that third generation and that group just said, I don't want to live here. I'd rather sell it for the cash and go someplace nice. Um, and that would have been unheard of. For and look at the last group that I worked with at Cloverleaf. It was very obvious that sooner or later something like that was going to happen because none of the kids were in the business.
Mhm,
I mean,
mhm.
so yeah, I mean, it, I think ironically that has more of an impact at a lower level today, as you're looking at people, look at how many people passed through South Dakota as part of the Air Force back when you had the missile ranges and everything else, and how many who have a small pension, are maximizing that pension to, by moving across the border into South Dakota. So it's, on the big business level, I don't know. I mean, now today it's more about the synergy of the dynamics of the groups you put together, mainly because we're no longer moving product as much. We're moving electrons, right?
Yeah.
And move those anywhere.
Well,
So
Bob and I come out of Nebraska, and they were, in fact, my uncle was involved in this. They were building missile silos as fast as wind turbines are going around here now. And those are obsolete.
Yeah, sure.
One last question, I'll leave you alone. I put this on chat.
Okay.
You know when the bridge, the name of the bridge going over the Big Sioux was changed from George Mickelson to Russ Christensen Bridge?
That was
it's Russ Christensen, but it only shows on the South Dakota side.
Well,
so in other words, if you're going into South Dakota, there's no sign. If you're coming from South Dakota into Iowa, there's where the sign is.
Janklow was governor. He found out that Russ Christensen was ill and immediately moved to have that changed. Normally in so many situations, most states and local governments say don't name anything after somebody who's still alive because they'll come back to do something embarrassing. And he just and we remember Janklow as the powerhouse, and he definitely was a stronger governor. And he just said, "You're going to make this happen." And they did that while Russ Christensen was still alive, so that he saw it. So that was prior to his death. And I'm trying to remember because I didn't write it down. I meant to put it in there. As I said, at the 10-year mark, I think he was still around to talk prior to the 10-year mark, but I think by the time of the 10 years, so I'm thinking he passed somewhere around 98, 99, somewhere in that area. And I had a whole lot of changes going on in my life, so it's not fixed in my memory, the way some of these others are. So, but that's how that happened, and that's when that happened, is roughly right at just a year or so before he died, if that. So
okay, thank you.
Yep.
An email address?
It's rgifford@russgifford.net. Folks, I hate the fact that I've kind of blanked all the rest of you out, but I hope you're enjoying this live history lesson we are all getting from a guy who lived it. I have greatly appreciated this, and you probably could see me on mine. I'm writing notes down as fast as he's giving me those details, and thank you so much for that. Thank you for being here. So
it's very interesting.
Yeah. Is it russgifford.net? I'm sorry.
You got it. So that's the last part after the at. So yep. So it's rgifford@russgifford.net.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you. I look forward to hearing from you. So if there's anybody else left, I hope you folks had a good night. Next week we're going to be looking at the fact that there are more Fortune 500 companies now led by women than ever in history, and we're going to look at what that means, the changes, and who some of those people are. And what that means for right now, and what that means for the future as well. What kind of changes that brought in, and can we look at that same criteria that we judge everybody by? How does that look when we judge them at the same time? So we also have, I can't remember the date offhand, but we do have the Everly Brothers coming up on our Rock Around the Clock, look at an era in America. And I'm looking forward to that one myself. So I hope you are too. And it all works this time. We are actually going to broadcast that one over over Zoom this way. So we will be doing it. So make sure you consider, we're going to make that happen so that you can take part in it too. So yay.
We're going to broadcast it over FaceTime.
Yep. Over FaceTime, is that what you said?
Yeah, and it's
Okay.
May 23rd
May 23rd. Thank you. All
at
right.
6:30.
I'm just going to ask, were you bothered by the fact that I spent as much time as I did reviewing last week? I really, I want to reinforce why I'm doing that. If you look at everything that's happening in our world today, it's the fact that, the founding fathers, I mean, because this really is the last tie up of that, of the four that preceded it. And the founding fathers had a belief in the value of hearing from the voters. And yeah, their world was different. They really held down who had the right to vote. But the one thing that we see today is you have to have an informed electorate. If you do not have an informed electorate, then what you get, it's garbage in, garbage out. And my point is, in talking to people, there's so much they don't know about their own local government. And my goal was, we have this moment, we've worked our way from the Articles of Confederation, really from monarchy to the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution, to how that Constitution spread to the states. And now we've seen how the states spread their Constitution to the counties, to your door. And it's important to understand, it's important to know that. And, I mean, the perfect example, of course, is, and not throwing stones, but I mean, as an electorate, who in the world would have thought that the LEC would have gone through on the first vote? I mean, it's time immemorable. Most bond issues for something like that are not going to go on the first try. They're going to make you sit down and sharpen your pencil. And they didn't this time. And how many millions, what percentage millions are you over? And all of that. It's important that we know and understand how these things work. So that's my point, and I wanted to tie that off. I wanted to bring it back, because then the other thing, as you just heard here, it's then how you work across these state lines. And you just heard the perfect example of, we saw how these folks worked across state lines to achieve something that is now over 35 years old and has made a difference in this region. So with that,
Russ, I would, Tim O'Neill said all politics is local, and I would like to go further into the weeds with Woodbury County for sure, and the city of Sioux City, because I think we have more control over those two entities than we do even at the state level. The state level is so out of control, and those people don't know what they're doing down there. Even our local representatives, I go to the League of Women Voters meetings all the time, and it's ridiculous.
mm-hmm.
When I brought up water quality this year, they're like, huh? They look at you, and we got the worst water in the country.
Yeah.
Maybe
they don't want to
North Carolina. No, I'm just kidding, Bob. Anyway, I would like to see us go into more county and city government, because I really think that's what people need, the young people, is these basic civic courses, so they have more control over what's going on.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Russ.
Thank you, everybody. And folks, thank you for your time and your patience tonight. And, hope to see you here next week. Any other questions?
Thanks for having me and listening to me, Russ.
Thank you, Bob. I really appreciate it. And Dr. Dunker, thank you so much. What you've done, what you've made possible is incredible. So I hope you all have a good night, and I hope to see you all, at least on my screen here soon. So take care, everybody.
Thanks, Russ.
Thanks, Russ.
Super job again. Loved it.
Thanks, Russ. Good night, everybody.
Night.
Good night. Good Good night, Pat. I didn't say hi to you before, so I want to make sure I do that. Thank you for being here. Ken, thank you for being here. Joan, we didn't get to have our little talk beforehand the way we usually do, so I will miss it, but I'll talk to you next week, I hope.
We'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Good night, everyone.